Something shifted in professional basketball the moment Adam Silver decided the WNBA wasn't a side project anymore. It wasn't a gradual transition or a memo sent to teams. It was a complete restructuring of how the league operates, and it all happened because one rookie from Iowa changed everything. Behind closed doors, while fans were debating statistics and shooting percentages, the most powerful figure in sports was orchestrating something far more calculated. Silver didn't just decide to protect Caitlyn Clark. He essentially rewrote the rules of the entire league to ensure her success. And that decision has created a ripple effect that's still shaking locker rooms, confusing veterans, and reshaping what it means to be a professional women's basketball player. The scary part: most people still don't realize the full extent of what's happening. This isn't just about one player getting special treatment. It's about how one person can fundamentally alter an entire sport's DNA in a single season. Every rule change, every officiating shift, every business decision traces back to a single strategy: make Caitlyn Clark untouchable. And what happened next would either save the WNBA or destroy everything it was built on. The conversation that changed everything didn't happen in a press conference or a public forum. It happened in a boardroom where Adam Silver sat across from the league's board of governors, and he made a case that was unlike anything they'd heard before. The WNBA, he explained, wasn't going to limp along as a developing league anymore. That era was finished. What the board discussed that day was expansion, but not the kind people expected. Silver presented them with something radical: a comprehensive analysis showing that the WNBA could become a genuine profit center for the NBA's ecosystem, not a charitable endeavor. The figures he presented weren't incremental improvements. They were exponential. And at the center of those projections was one name that kept appearing in every financial model: Caitlyn Clark. The timing was everything. By the time Clark entered the league, the WNBA had been functioning under a particular mindset for decades. It was a league built on hard-nosed basketball, physical play, and the belief that every player had to earn their stripes through veteran hazing and competitive grinding. Rookies weren't coddled, they were tested. They were pushed to prove they belonged. This wasn't cruelty, it was tradition. It was how every generation of players had come up, and it had created a certain toughness that defined women's basketball culture. But Silver looked at those same traditions and saw something different. He saw obstacles to profit. He saw barriers to mainstream viewership. He saw things that had to be dismantled. What happened next was a subtle but total shift in how the league operated. The board tasked the league office with conducting what they called an in-depth analysis. But this wasn't a typical competitive review. This was a strategic audit designed to identify every single element of the game that might discourage casual viewers from watching. The results were brutal in their honesty. Physical play? Casual viewers didn't want that. They wanted highlights. They wanted fast breaks and three-pointers that went viral on social media. Defensive grinding? Boring. The beautiful thing about having data to back up these conclusions was that Silver could present them as objective truth rather than preferences. The turning point came when Silver made his position crystal clear to the league office. Caitlyn Clark was a billion-dollar asset, and she needed to be treated as such. Not a suggestion, not a mild recommendation. This was a directive that carried weight and consequences. Anyone who didn't understand the assignment would face repercussions. The harshest part of this decision wasn't the what, it was the how it would be implemented. Because protecting Clark didn't just mean rulebook changes or slight tweaks to officiating. It meant a complete restructuring of game governance, marketing strategy, and how the sport was physically transported and presented to audiences. The first sign of this new regime came when players started noticing something odd happening on the court. In Clark's early games, there were moments of physical play that seemed almost designed to welcome the rookie. Veterans took hard fouls. There were shoulders thrown. One moment that stuck with people was when a defender made contact at midcourt that seemed less like basketball and more like football. These weren't isolated incidents. Multiple players reported similar experiences. What was supposed to be a learning curve turned into something uglier. The league wasn't just allowing physical play. It seemed to be facilitating it. Adam Silver's realization came after watching multiple games where Clark absorbed hits that other rookies might not have survived. The league office had to grapple with an uncomfortable question. Was this the cost of tradition, or was this an active threat to their business? The answer they arrived at was brutal and quick. The let-them-play mindset that had defined the WNBA for years was suddenly detrimental to business. That wasn't an emotional conclusion. That was a financial one. And once a decision becomes about money rather than principle, enforcement becomes absolute. What followed was a shift in officiating that was so dramatic that even casual fans started to notice something had changed. Suddenly, fouls that had gone uncalled for years were being whistled immediately when they involved Clark. Defensive players found themselves with technical fouls for things that used to be part of standard playoff intensity. The whistle was becoming a tool of protection, and every referee who didn't understand that assignment found themselves quietly moved off the assignments that mattered. The message wasn't subtle. It was being delivered in real time, game after game. The reaction in locker rooms was immediate and visceral. Veterans felt like the rules were being rewritten in real time to protect one individual. There was genuine anger about the perceived inequity. Some players openly questioned whether they were watching basketball or theater. But the league office's response was always the same. The data supports this approach. Casual viewership was climbing. Engagement was through the roof. Everything pointed to one conclusion: the protectionist stance was working. And if it was working financially, nothing else mattered. The most cutting part of Silver's decision wasn't the officiating changes or the rule interpretations. It was the psychological message being sent. By protecting Clark this aggressively, Silver was essentially telling every other player in the league, you don't matter as much as this one person. Your comfort doesn't matter. Your traditions don't matter. Your legacy built over years doesn't matter. What matters is maximizing the value of our most valuable asset. It was business at its most honest, and it was brutal. The WNBA had been forced to grow up overnight, and that growth came with casualties. Careers were being affected. Playing styles were becoming obsolete, and everyone in the league knew exactly why it was happening. But here's what Silver understood that others didn't. The ratings told the whole story. Games featuring Clark drew audiences 10 times larger than regular WNBA contests. That wasn't a coincidence. That was the market speaking. And once the market speaks that clearly, everything else becomes negotiable. The league couldn't afford for a veteran enforcer to injure their golden ticket and derail the entire financial future. So they made their choice. They chose profit. They chose growth. They chose Clark. And in doing so, they changed women's basketball forever. When Caitlyn Clark stepped onto a WNBA floor for the first time as a professional, everyone expected the typical rookie welcome. Physical play, intense defense, the kind of trial by fire that had been part of women's basketball culture for generations. New players had always faced this test, and it was seen as necessary. It separated the pretenders from the real competitors. It taught rookies what professional basketball actually demanded. But what happened in Clark's case went beyond the traditional welcome. It escalated into something that made league executives genuinely uncomfortable, and not because of player safety, at least not initially. They became uncomfortable because they realized the aggression was threatening their investment. The moments kept adding up. There was the mid-court shoulder check that seemed designed to send a message. There were late fouls that looked more aggressive than protective. One defender was caught on video essentially tackling Clark near half-court, and while the whistle eventually blew, the damage was already done. These weren't subtle plays. They were statements. Veteran players were essentially telling the rookie, you might be special, but you're still new here, and you need to prove yourself in our world. It was the WNBA's version of hazing, and it followed a script that had been running for decades. The physical toll became evident as the season progressed. Clark was getting hit more than typical rookies. Some of it was defensive intensity, sure, but some of it felt personal. There were moments where the physicality seemed designed to test not just her skill, but her willingness to absorb punishment. And here's where the narrative splits into two versions, one that plays out on the court and one that plays out in the league office. On the court, players were following the traditional rules of engagement. In the league office, alarm bells were ringing because those traditional rules were now threatening profitability. Adam Silver's realization came after witnessing multiple games where Clark absorbed hits that other rookies might not have survived. The league office had to grapple with an uncomfortable question. Was this the cost of tradition, or was this an active threat to their business? The answer they arrived at was brutal and quick. The let-them-play mindset that had defined the WNBA for years was suddenly detrimental to business. That wasn't an emotional conclusion. That was a financial one. And once a decision becomes about money rather than principle, enforcement becomes absolute and unforgiving. What followed was a shift in officiating that was so dramatic that even casual fans started to notice something had changed. Suddenly, fouls that had gone uncalled for years were being whistled immediately when they involved Clark. Defensive players found themselves with technical fouls for things that used to be part of standard playoff intensity. The whistle was becoming a tool of protection, and every referee who didn't understand that assignment found themselves quietly moved off the assignments that mattered. The message wasn't subtle. It was being delivered in real time, game after game, with unmistakable clarity. The psychological effect on defenders was immediate and corrosive. Veteran players who had built their entire identity around physical, grinding defense suddenly found themselves operating in a minefield. Every play against Clark had to be calculated with military precision. Too aggressive, flagrant foul, not aggressive enough, questions about your commitment. The pressure created paranoia. Players genuinely felt that they couldn't breathe on Clark without triggering an officiating response. The playing field didn't just tilt, it became unrecognizable to everyone who had played on it before. What made this situation so volatile was that the league wasn't just changing the rules, it was changing them selectively. Clark could be defended a certain way that would draw calls if anyone else attempted it. Other players could be contacted in ways that didn't generate the same whistle. The inconsistency was the real poison, because when rules are applied inconsistently, it stops being basketball and starts being something else. It starts feeling rigged. And once players feel a game is rigged, the locker room culture shifts into something darker and more resentful. The league's justification for this approach was built entirely on viewing the situation through a business lens. They argued correctly that casual viewers don't want to watch defensive slugfests. They want to watch highlight reel plays. They want to see a player pull up from 40 feet and drain a three. They want viral moments. That's what drives social media engagement. That's what drives viewership numbers. That's what justifies the massive television contracts. So from a purely business perspective, the decision to tighten the whistle made perfect sense. You protect your asset. You maximize their performance. You let them create the moments that TV partners are paying millions to broadcast. But here's what the league didn't account for: the cost of that decision in terms of locker room culture. Veteran players who had spent decades playing a certain way suddenly felt like they were operating in an unfamiliar sport. Defensive specialists found their skill set becoming obsolete. And more subtly, there was a message being sent that transcended basketball. Some players matter more than others. Not because of what they'd accomplished or the respect they'd earned, but because of their market value. That's a different kind of statement, and it fundamentally altered how players viewed their place in the league. The defenders most affected by this were the ones who'd never had an issue with physical basketball. They weren't dirty players. They weren't trying to injure anyone. They were just playing the way they'd been taught, the way the league had always functioned. Suddenly, that same approach was being treated as a violation of some new code. It created genuine confusion. Some coaches had to completely overhaul their defensive systems in the middle of the season. The disruption was massive, and it all traced back to one central fact. The league had decided that protecting Clark was more important than maintaining consistency. The decision to exclude Caitlyn Clark from the Olympic selection process caught everyone off guard. On the surface, it seemed bizarre. Here was the biggest star in women's basketball, a player generating unprecedented interest in the sport, and she wasn't selected for the national team. The official story was that it was a basketball decision, that there were more seasoned participants higher in the hierarchy. That explanation might have worked if it came from a vacuum. But inside the league office and among industry insiders who understand how these decisions are actually made, a very different story was being told in whispered conversations. Rumors began circulating almost immediately. The league office, the theory went, had heavily influenced the Olympic selection process, but not for the reasons most people would assume. It wasn't that Clark wasn't good enough. Anyone making that argument was either delusional or dishonest. She was the most dynamic player in the league. The real reason, according to multiple sources with visibility into league operations, was far more calculated and coldly strategic. The NBA and WNBA didn't want Clark playing international basketball during the peak of the season. They didn't want her competing for an Olympic team. They wanted complete control over her availability, her narrative, and her energy expenditure. The solution to this situation was straightforward if you understood the business logic. Keep her home, manage her fatigue, ensure she remains fresh and available for the most important games on the professional calendar. The regular season matters. The playoffs matter. The games that drive television revenue matter. Olympic competition, while prestigious and career-defining for most players, didn't fit into the equation. From a pure business standpoint, an Olympic medal is a legacy achievement. A full season of healthy, spectacular play that drives record viewership numbers is a revenue achievement. And revenue always wins when Adam Silver is making the decision. What made this particularly cruel was the timing and the optics. Clark was at the absolute peak of her powers. She was exactly the kind of player who could have defined an Olympic run and cemented her legacy on the international stage. But that's precisely why she couldn't be allowed to play. Because Olympic competition is unpredictable. It's grueling. It takes even the best players and tests them in ways that regular season basketball doesn't. A 4-week commitment to international competition could result in injury. It could result in fatigue that carries into the professional season. It could result in situations outside the league's control, and the league couldn't afford any of that risk. The Olympic decision was a calculated bet that put the league's financial success ahead of the individual player's development of global legacy. It was the moment when it became crystal clear that Caitlyn Clark wasn't just being protected, she was being managed. She wasn't an athlete making her own decisions about her career. She was a business asset with stakeholders making decisions about how to maximize her value. And those stakeholders had concluded that Olympic participation was a threat to their return on investment. What made this approach so stunning was the precedent it set. For years, the WNBA had been a league where veteran players made their own decisions about national team participation. Players who wanted to play for their country played. It was seen as a fundamental right and an honor. But with Clark, that dynamic shifted entirely. The league essentially made the decision for her, and the framing was done in a way that made it seem like a basketball call. That's the sophistication of the operation. You don't announce that you're controlling a player's career options. You make a basketball argument that sounds reasonable, and you let the cover story do the work. The backlash came immediately from fans who felt deceived by the process. There was a sense that something fundamental about player autonomy had shifted in ways that couldn't be reversed. Players were supposed to be able to make their own professional decisions. But if the league could quietly influence selection decisions to suit their financial interests, what did that mean for player agency in this new era? The answer, increasingly, seemed to be: player agency exists only when it aligns with league interests. When it conflicts, the league wins. What's particularly interesting about this decision is how it reveals the true architecture of Silver's strategy. He wasn't just protecting Clark on the court through officiating decisions. He was managing every aspect of her existence as a professional athlete: how much she plays, which competitions she participates in, how her image is marketed, how her schedule is constructed. Everything was being optimized for maximum value extraction. And Olympic exclusion was just one piece of that larger puzzle. The league's justification for the Olympic decision, when industry insiders discussed it, always circled back to fatigue management. They would argue that they were actually protecting Clark's long-term career by keeping her fresh for the WNBA season. That's technically true, but it's also a complete reframing of what was actually happening. The league wasn't making a decision out of benevolence toward Clark. They were making a decision because an injured Clark is worth $0 to them. A healthy Clark is worth billions. The fatigue management argument was just the language used to make a purely financial decision sound like it was about player welfare. The precedent set by the Olympic exclusion was massive. It essentially established that when player development conflicts with league profitability wins. Every decision that followed became easier to justify under that same logic. Charter flights, league interests, Rule changes, league interests. Officiating adjustments, league interests. Player concerns, irrelevant unless they align with business objectives. The Olympic decision wasn't just about one summer tournament. It was about establishing the hierarchy of priorities in Silver's WNBA, and that hierarchy put money at the top. The television rights negotiation that resulted in the $2.2 billion contract was the financial backbone that made everything else possible. But most people don't understand how fundamental that deal is to understanding the new WNBA. This wasn't just a transaction where Disney, NBC, and Amazon agreed to pay more money for basketball content. This was a complete restructuring of power dynamics within the league, and Caitlyn Clark's rookie statistics were the primary negotiating weapon that Adam Silver wielded to get it done. Before Clark arrived, the WNBA's television situation was stable but limited. The league had rights deals, but they were structured around what the WNBA had always been, a developing league with a loyal but niche audience. Networks treated women's basketball as a secondary product. Games got slots that were convenient for the network, not necessarily optimal for audiences. Production quality was good, but not premium. The overall message from the television industry was clear. Women's basketball is worth investing in, but it's not worth premium investment. That changed overnight when Silver entered negotiations, armed with Clark's undeniable viewership numbers. The statistics were absolutely undeniable. Games featuring Clark were drawing audiences that dwarfed regular WNBA broadcasts by astonishing margins. The magnitude of the difference wasn't incremental, it was exponential. Networks that had relegated women's basketball to cable were suddenly seeing numbers that challenged their fundamental assumptions about audience interest. And Silver knew exactly how to weaponize that information. When he sat down to negotiate with television executives, he didn't present the WNBA as a developing league hoping to grow. He presented it as an emerging sports property with a genuine superstar catalyst that could drive mainstream viewership. The networks essentially bought into a monumental bet. They were investing $2.2 billion over multiple years, based on the assumption that Caitlyn Clark would remain healthy, available, and spectacular for the duration of the contract. That's the most important detail that almost nobody talks about. The entire value of that television deal is directly contingent on Clark's continued success. If she suffers a career-ending injury, the network investments become questionable. If her performance declines, viewership likely declines with it. If she leaves the league early, the whole equation changes. That's why the league's protection of Clark wasn't just about competitive fairness. It was about protecting a multi-billion-dollar investment that television partners had just made. This created a new dynamic where the WNBA's traditional leadership suddenly became secondary to network interests. The television partners had just written massive checks, and they had specific expectations about what they were going to get in return. Those expectations were built around a very specific product: Caitlyn Clark, healthy and dominant, in showcase moments broadcast across premium platforms. That meant the league office wasn't just running a basketball league anymore. They were running a television production studio designed to deliver specific content to specific corporate partners. What made this shift so significant was how it affected the internal power structure of the WNBA. The traditional leadership of the league, the voices that had guided women's basketball for decades, suddenly found themselves in a supporting role. Silver's intervention wasn't just about protecting one player. It was about establishing that the league's future direction would be determined by corporate interests and television ratings, not by the people who had built the league. That's a brutal transition for any organization, but it was accelerated in the WNBA because the financial stakes suddenly became so enormous and so visible. The television deal also changed how every single decision in the league was evaluated moving forward. Before, decisions were made with multiple stakeholders in mind. Player welfare, competitive integrity, traditional values, these things mattered in the calculus. Now, every decision was filtered through a single question: does this serve the television product? Charter flights for players, only if they're necessary to ensure Clark's safety and availability. Rule changes, only if they create more exciting television for viewers. officiating adjustments only if they lead to higher-scoring games that appeal to casual viewers, roster decisions only if they maximize the value of the primary product. The conversation between Silver and the television networks essentially boiled down to this: we have a superstar who can make women's basketball mainstream. Here's what we need to do to ensure her continued success. Are you in? The networks were in, and they were willing to back that bet with billions of dollars. That vote of confidence was simultaneously the best thing that ever happened to the WNBA and the most destabilizing force it had ever experienced. Because once television money becomes that dominant, everything else becomes negotiable. The smaller details of the television deal reveal how thoroughly the power structure had shifted beneath the surface. Broadcast schedules were now determined by what looked best on camera, not what made sense competitively. Games featuring Clark got primetime slots regardless of who she was playing. Production budgets were allocated based on Clark's involvement in specific matchups. Commentary teams for her games were built around storytelling and drama rather than pure basketball analysis. The networks didn't just invest in the WNBA. They took ownership of the narrative and the entire product design. What's particularly interesting is how this television deal changed the way the league office communicated with teams and players going forward. Instead of saying, "We're implementing this change because we believe it's best for basketball," they could say, "The television partners require this change to fulfill their contractual obligations." Suddenly, controversial decisions weren't the league's choices, they were network requirements. It's a subtle but powerful shift in how authority is exercised. You're not the villain making a cold business decision. You're just fulfilling obligations to powerful partners who hold the league's financial future in their hands. The decision to provide charter flights for all WNBA teams marked a symbolic moment that went far beyond player comfort and quality of life. On the surface, it was a quality of life improvement that the players' union had been requesting for years. Women's basketball players had long endured the indignities of commercial air travel: middle seats, long security lines, flight delays, the exhaustion that comes from navigating an airport at 6 a.m. before a crucial game. Meanwhile, NBA players had charter flights built into their standard operation as a basic right. It was one of the most visible symbols of the disparity between men's and women's basketball. So, when the league suddenly approved tens of millions of dollars for private travel across the entire WNBA, it seemed like a massive victory for player advocacy. But the timing of this decision was too convenient to be purely about player welfare and equality. The charter flight mandate came at the exact moment when security concerns surrounding Caitlyn Clark's enormous crowds were making headlines daily. Security issues at airports, crowd management problems, logistical complications when a superstar travels commercially and attracts intense public attention. The league's official position was that charter flights were a safety measure for all players. But everyone in the industry understood what was actually happening. They were implementing a system designed to protect Clark, and they were using that system to improve conditions for everyone else. It was a savvy political move that made a potentially controversial decision seem like a league-wide improvement. What makes this so brilliant from a business standpoint is how it reframed a protection measure as a universal benefit. Instead of announcing, "We're implementing charter flights because Clark needs special security," they announced, "We're upgrading travel for all players," which is technically true but obscures the primary motivation. And once the charter system was in place, every player benefited from it. Suddenly, veteran players who might have resented special treatment for the rookie couldn't complain because they were enjoying better travel conditions themselves. The league had essentially bought off potential opposition by bundling Clark's protection into a league-wide upgrade. The financial implications were staggering. Tens of millions of dollars per season just for private travel across the entire league. That money had to come from somewhere, and it came directly from revenue generated by Clark and the television deals she'd helped secure. In a very real sense, the charter flights were being subsidized by the one player they were ostensibly designed to protect. It's the kind of circular logic that works perfectly as long as Clark remains the league's primary revenue generator. But it also creates a financial dependency that's unsustainable if anything changes. For smaller market teams, the charter flight mandate created a different kind of problem. Some franchises weren't prepared for the massive increase in overhead costs and operational complexity. Their operating budgets had been carefully constructed around commercial travel. Suddenly, they had to absorb the cost of charter flights, and some of them simply didn't have the revenue to support that expansion. The league eventually worked out subsidy arrangements, but the message was clear. If you can't handle first-class operations, you don't belong in this new WNBA. It was a subtle but effective way of consolidating ownership around teams with sufficient capital. What's particularly revealing about the charter flight decision is what it signaled about the league's ambitions beyond basketball itself. Silver wasn't just making a decision about how players would travel between cities. He was making a statement about what the WNBA aspired to be as an organization. The message was, we are no longer a developing league willing to accept substandard operating procedures. We are a major professional sports league with premium standards. If that costs money, we'll spend it. If that strains some teams' budgets, that's their problem. This is the new baseline, and everyone needs to meet it. The psychological impact on players was significant and lasting. For decades, women's basketball players had been told to be grateful for what they had. The WNBA was a privilege, not a right. Players should accept commercial travel, modest accommodations, and limited marketing budgets because that's what a developing league could afford. But suddenly, private flights were the standard. Luxury was the expectation. Players weren't being asked to be grateful anymore. They were being told they deserved first-class treatment. That shift in messaging changed how players viewed their place in the professional sports hierarchy. For Clark specifically, charter flights served multiple purposes beyond comfort. They provided the security infrastructure necessary to protect her from the massive crowds and intense public attention that followed her everywhere. They allowed her to travel in comfort between games, which translated to better rest and recovery for her body. They also served as a constant, visible reminder that she was different from everyone else. Every time players boarded private jets instead of commercial planes, they were reminded that the WNBA had changed fundamentally, and that change had been driven by one person's arrival. But here's where it gets complicated. The charter flight system also created vulnerabilities in smaller markets. Teams in Portland, Toronto, and other cities that were part of the accelerated expansion plans suddenly found themselves trying to build competitive rosters while absorbing massive overhead costs. The financial model that worked for big market franchises didn't necessarily work everywhere. Some team owners who'd been excited about the WNBA's growth suddenly found themselves struggling with the operating costs of a premium league. The relationship between charter flights and expansion is crucial to understanding Silver's full strategy. By raising the operational standards across the league, he was essentially creating a barrier to entry for potential owners who didn't have significant capital. You want to own a WNBA team now? You need to be prepared for charter flights, premium facilities, and first-class operations across the board. That filters out smaller investors and ensures that the league remains controlled by well-capitalized ownership groups. It's a consolidation strategy disguised as a quality-of-life improvement. The accelerated expansion plan represents perhaps the most audacious gamble in Adam Silver's entire WNBA strategy. The league wasn't just planning to add a team or two, it was planning to double in size within a short timeframe. New franchises were being moved to Portland, Toronto, and Golden State, with serious expansion discussions happening in multiple other cities simultaneously. The speed of this expansion was unprecedented for the WNBA, which had typically been cautious about growth, preferring to build sustainable operations rather than chase rapid scaling. But caution is incompatible with maximizing the Clark era, and Silver clearly understood that this window of opportunity had a limited and potentially finite duration. The financial projections that justified rapid expansion were built entirely on one central assumption: that Caitlyn Clark's popularity and the attendant media rights revenue would continue generating sufficient capital to support a larger league. It was a bet on sustained superstardom from a rookie, which should have been risky enough that boards of governors would exercise more caution. But the television deals had been signed. The market had spoken with remarkable clarity. The momentum was undeniable, and Silver was making it clear that hesitation was no longer an option. Either teams were part of the expansion wave, or they were getting left behind in a league that was growing around them. What made this expansion strategy so harsh for existing teams was the mechanism through which new rosters would be populated: expansion drafts. When new franchises join the league, they need players. That means existing teams would have to make certain players available for selection by the new teams. Every roster that had been carefully constructed over years would be disrupted. Players that teams had nurtured and developed would potentially be selected away. The competitive balance of the league would be thrown into chaos, at least temporarily. And that disruption was being justified as the cost of capitalizing on the Clark moment. The harsh reality for current players was that they'd built their careers in a certain WNBA, and that league was being fundamentally altered around them. Players who had believed they'd spend their entire careers with a single franchise suddenly faced the possibility of being moved in expansion drafts. Players who had negotiated contracts based on expected salary cap figures were now looking at a league structure that would be completely different. The expansion wasn't just adding teams, it was actively restructuring the professional lives of everyone already in the league. The business logic behind rapid expansion is actually straightforward. More teams means more games, more television inventory, more jersey sales, more market opportunities. If Clark is generating massive engagement, the solution isn't to hoard her appearances, it's to create more content around her. More games featuring her team means more opportunities for advertisers, networks, and sponsors to participate in the Clark phenomenon. From a pure revenue perspective, it makes perfect sense. You find the golden goose, and you maximize its productivity before it stops laying golden eggs. But there's a darker side to this strategy. Rapid expansion in any sports league traditionally dilutes the quality of play. You're adding teams faster than you're adding talent. That means existing players are spread thinner. Rosters that had certain depth are suddenly being asked to compete while missing their best players to expansion drafts. The product on the court, at least in the short term, becomes weaker. That's usually seen as an acceptable cost of expansion, but only if you believe the league is getting stronger in other ways. In the WNBA's case, the gamble is that the novelty of new markets and the continued dominance of Clark will more than compensate. The union's response to rapid expansion was predictably complicated. On one hand, expanding the league means more job opportunities for players. More teams need more players, which theoretically improves job security and competition for talent. On the other hand, expansion through the draft mechanism means existing players lose control over their situations. The calculus was brutal. Players might get slightly better long-term prospects in a larger, better-funded league, but in the immediate term, expansion was disruptive and threatening. What's particularly revealing about the expansion strategy is that it demonstrates Silver's confidence in the Clark phenomenon being durable. He's not just betting that she'll have a good rookie season. He's betting that she'll remain a superstar who can sustain a growing league for years. If that bet fails, if Clark's appeal fades, or if she suffers an injury, the entire expansion plan becomes a massive financial liability. Teams in new markets won't have the revenue streams they were promised. Television partners won't get the engagement they were expecting. The business model collapses, but Silver is willing to make that bet at a scale that most league leaders wouldn't consider. The expansion cities themselves reveal the strategy's priorities. Golden State, Toronto, and Portland were chosen not necessarily because they were the best markets for women's basketball, but because they offered the highest population density and media prominence. These were cities where the WNBA could maximize visibility and sponsorship opportunities. It wasn't about building a sustainable league distributed across diverse markets. It was about concentrating resources in places where the Clark-fueled WNBA could achieve maximum financial penetration. For existing franchises, the expansion represented a mixed message from the league office. On one hand, the league was saying, "We believe in this product so much that we're expanding aggressively." On the other hand, it was saying, "We're willing to sacrifice competitive balance and player continuity to maximize revenue in the short term." That's not the kind of mixed message that builds long-term trust between league and teams. Some franchise owners who'd invested in the WNBA for the long term suddenly found their positions destabilized by a strategy that prioritized rapid growth over stability and sustainable development. The changes to how the WNBA was officiated represent the most visceral manifestation of Silver's intervention in the league. These weren't subtle tweaks or gentle guidance from the league office. These were dramatic shifts in what was and wasn't allowed on the basketball court, and they were implemented with remarkable speed and consistency. Locker room uprisings have been sparked by these changes alone, as entire defensive philosophies became obsolete overnight. Imagine having a decade of professional experience and being told suddenly that the way you've learned to defend is no longer acceptable. That's exactly what happened to defensive specialists across the league. The rule changes were framed as being about player safety and game flow, but everyone understood what was actually happening. The league was rewriting the rules of engagement specifically to protect one player. Suddenly, contact that had been part of the game for years was being called as a foul. A light touch on the arm that would have gone unnoticed became a whistle. Physical defense that had been considered grit and determination was suddenly aggressive and dangerous. The whistle became a tool of selective enforcement, and selective enforcement is just another word for bias. What's particularly damaging about selective enforcement is the psychological warfare it creates on the court. Defensive players became paranoid. They genuinely couldn't tell what was and wasn't allowed anymore because the rules seemed to change based on who was involved. A veteran defender could make a play they'd made 1,000 times and suddenly find themselves with a technical foul. The uncertainty created hesitation, and hesitation ruined defensive performance. That's actually brilliant from a strategist's perspective. You don't have to explicitly change the rules if you can make the rules so inconsistently enforced that defenders can't function. They police themselves through fear. The referees themselves became characters in this unfolding drama. Some embraced the new enforcement standards enthusiastically. Others resisted, believing that inconsistent officiating was damaging the game's integrity fundamentally. The league noticed these differences, and there were clear consequences. Referees who were comfortable with the new wide-open style found themselves assigned to premium games, to Clark's most important contests. Referees who continued to call games the traditional way found themselves quietly moved off assignments. It wasn't overt punishment, but the message was crystal clear. Get on board with the new officiating approach, or your career trajectory changes. This two-tier system created its own set of problems and complications. When referees know that their job security depends on making specific calls in specific ways, the integrity of the game becomes compromised at a fundamental level. They're not calling what they objectively see, they're calling what they've been incentivized to call. Some longtime refs found this deeply troubling. They'd spent careers building reputations for consistency and fairness, and suddenly they were being asked to abandon that in service of a business agenda. The defensive players who suffered most under these rule changes were the ones who'd built their entire identity around physical play. The wing defenders who thrived in the grinding style of WNBA basketball. The post players who defended through presence and physical positioning. These players suddenly had to learn an entirely new skill set in the middle of their careers. Some adapted brilliantly. Others couldn't, and their effectiveness declined dramatically. Watching a veteran defender lose their value because the rules changed is painful, especially when everyone knows the rules changed specifically to benefit one player. What made the situation even more complicated was that coaches had to completely overhaul their defensive systems mid-season. Playbooks that had been developed over years of experience became obsolete. Schemes that worked under the old rules didn't work under the new ones. Coaches had to make real-time adjustments to their fundamental defensive philosophy, and they had very little time to implement those changes effectively. Some coaches adapted brilliantly. Others struggled, and their team's performance suffered accordingly. The most psychologically damaging aspect of the rule changes was the implicit message they sent to defenders. The message was, you don't matter, your skill doesn't matter, your experience doesn't matter. What matters is that one player succeeds. If that requires neutralizing defensive talent, that's what will happen. Some veteran defenders described feeling devalued, like they'd suddenly become obstacles to be managed rather than competitors to be respected. That kind of psychological blow reverberates through locker rooms and changes how players relate to their profession. There were also moments where the officiating approach created genuinely dangerous situations. When you tighten the whistle to the point that defenders become too hesitant to defend, sometimes that creates situations where players are actually at greater risk of injury. Without physical pressure, a player can take risks they otherwise wouldn't. A defender who's afraid to make contact won't be positioned properly to help if a teammate gets in trouble. The irony is that by trying to protect Clark through officiating, the league may have actually created situations where the overall safety of play was compromised. Some referees who publicly questioned the new enforcement approach found themselves facing quiet consequences. The league office made it known that consistency with the new standards was expected. Referees who filed complaints or expressed concerns about the integrity implications were moved to less desirable assignments. It became a system where compliance was rewarded and principled resistance was punished. That's the kind of institutional messaging that corrupts an organization's culture over time. The WNBA has historically built its identity on sisterhood, mutual respect, and unity. The marketing narratives of the league emphasized how players supported each other, how the culture was collaborative rather than cutthroat. That's not to say there weren't rivalries, there absolutely were. But the league's official positioning was that women's basketball was defined by respect for the game and respect among competitors. It was part of what made the WNBA culturally distinct from the NBA. That culture has been fundamentally altered under Silver's watch, and the change has been deliberate and strategic throughout. The shift toward conflict-driven marketing became obvious once you started looking at how the league promoted players and storylines. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't about players supporting each other. It was about competition between rookies, drama between veterans and newcomers, tension in the locker room. The league started playing up the rivalry between Caitlyn Clark and Angel Reese, two players who had history from college basketball. Instead of downplaying that rivalry, the league amplified it. Games between their teams became must-see events marketed around conflict rather than basketball quality. This is a dramatic departure from how the WNBA had traditionally marketed itself. The league's founding principle was that women's basketball offered something different from men's basketball: a collaborative environment, genuine friendships between competitors, and mutual respect. But Silver understood something that the previous WNBA leadership didn't: conflict sells. Drama drives ratings. Rivalries create narrative tension that keeps people engaged. So the league began deliberately cultivating storylines that position players against each other rather than united in a common cause. The players have noticed this shift, and it's created tension within the league's culture. Some younger players have embraced the drama-driven approach and actively participated in creating compelling conflict narratives. Other veteran players see it as a betrayal of the collaborative values that built the league. There's a generational divide happening in real time, where older WNBA players feel like the league has abandoned its founding principles in pursuit of mainstream entertainment, while younger players see drama as simply how professional sports work in the modern media environment. What's particularly revealing is how the league's social media accounts started promoting conflict deliberately. They would create content emphasizing the tension between Clark and other players. They would highlight competitive moments and frame them through the lens of rivalry rather than respect. They would amplify controversial plays and turn them into fodder for endless discourse. It's the same approach that's made the NBA endlessly entertaining for mainstream audiences, but it's an uncomfortable fit for a league that had always positioned itself as culturally different from its male counterpart. The impact on locker room culture has been significant and somewhat dark. Players who used to see each other as allies in building women's basketball found themselves cast as rivals or antagonists in narratives designed for entertainment value. A player might make a hard defensive play, and instead of that being respected as good defense, it gets framed as a villain moment in the Clark hero narrative. Suddenly, players aren't just competing on the court, they're competing for narrative positioning. That changes how players interact with each other off the court. Some players have pushed back on this approach, but the league has made it clear that conflict narratives are here to stay. The marketing data supports it. Drama drives engagement. Conflict drives social media conversations. Rivalries drive ticket sales. All of the incentives point toward amplifying conflict, not reducing it. So the league continues to push conflict narratives, and players increasingly understand that participating in drama is part of professional basketball now. That's a cultural shift that will have long-term implications for how players view their relationships with each other. The union has been concerned about how players are being portrayed as antagonists in narratives that aren't entirely in their control. A player might make a normal basketball play, and it gets turned into a villain moment by league marketing. That loss of narrative control is disempowering. Players have spent their careers building their own personal brands and managing their own images. Having the league take over that function and use it to create storylines for entertainment purposes feels like an infringement on player agency. What's interesting is how this conflict-driven marketing approach has actually worked from an engagement standpoint. The numbers are undeniable. Games featuring dramatic storylines and competitive tension between players generate more interest than games without that narrative layer. The league has monetized conflict in a way that probably wouldn't have been possible under the old sisterhood-focused marketing approach. But there's a cost to that monetization, even if it's not immediately visible on a spreadsheet. It's a cost paid in locker room culture, in player relationships, and in the values that the Wnba used to represent. The younger generation of players has largely accepted this shift. They grew up watching an NBA where drama and conflict are normalized and monetized. For them, the Wnba's new approach isn't a betrayal. It's just how professional basketball works. That generational divide points to a future where the Wnba's old values become increasingly nostalgic rather than operational. The new normal will be conflict-driven, drama-focused marketing, and players who came up in that environment won't know anything different. For Caitlyn Clark specifically, being at the center of conflict narratives is complicated. On one hand, it generates massive engagement and attention. On the other hand, it can be exhausting being constantly positioned as the hero in conflict stories. Some of the drama gets manufactured specifically to create content around her. The league benefits from framing her as the protagonist in various battles, but Clark is still a human being dealing with the emotional weight of being cast as the center of constant conflict. That kind of pressure is part of the cost of being the league's primary asset. The decisions Adam Silver has made in his first year overseeing the Wnba's transformation around Caitlyn Clark will reverberate for decades to come. What started as rules designed to protect one rookie has evolved into a complete restructuring of how professional women's basketball operates. The Wnba is no longer trying to build slowly and sustain carefully. It's moving at a pace that makes veteran players uncomfortable and creates genuine uncertainty about what the league will look like 5 years from now. Here's what remains unclear. When the next superstar arrives, will they receive the same level of protection and promotion? Will they get chartered flights, Olympic management, and a fence-friendly officiating? Or was this infrastructure built specifically for Clark because she represented a unique moment in the sport's history? The ambiguity is intentional. The league wants flexibility to decide these questions case by case, based on business calculations made at that moment. The Wnba that exists now is fundamentally different from the league that existed before Clark arrived. Some changes are positive: better travel, higher salaries, more media attention, improved working conditions. Other changes are more troubling: the erosion of player autonomy, the prioritization of entertainment value over athletic integrity, the shift toward conflict-driven culture. Whatever your perspective on these changes, one thing is certain: there's no going back to the old Wnba. Silver has moved the league forward, and now everyone has to decide whether they're moving with it or getting left behind.